Now we'll learn about a third kind of line, cross contour. We'll see how it's related to a special kind of shape, oblique shape, and we'll learn how oblique shapes are related to geometric solids. We'll use this new knowledge to make the objects we draw appear three-dimensional. Related to aggregate shape, we'll introduce the concept of figure-ground relationships, which will help us structure our drawings in a more sophisticated way. You'll need some pencils, erasers, and some smaller paper. 8.5 by 11-inch printer paper or a medium-sized sketchbook would be fine. You'll also need 2 sheets of 18 by 24-inch white paper and a couple sticks of vine charcoal. You'll also be using your still life table and 8 to 10 simple objects, things like we used in the last lecture. The drawings we've made so far have been pretty flat, and this limitation leads us to consider our next type of line, cross contour. These are lines that exist inside the contours. They magically transform flat shape into volumetric solids. Here's a hexagon. It's drawn with contour, 6 lines. By introducing 3 interior lines cross contour, we transform it into a 3D cube, here seen from above. Here's an identical hexagon. To draw a cube seen from below, we change the cross contours. Now we're looking up at the cube. And this will work with curvilinear forms as well. Draw a modified rectangle, one with a curving top and bottom. Add a single curved line, this creates a top plane, and you've got a cylinder seen from above. Invert the cross contour to create a cylinder seen from below. Remember this figure from the first lecture? The beginnings of our piece of Jarlsberg. The internal line is a cross contour. Take it away, you get a flat shape, a trapezoid. Let's draw a circle. Now add a curved line along the horizontal axis, and we've transformed it into a sphere. Draw another over its vertical axis, and the illusion's that much more pronounced. By drawing our cross contours, we've also created a new kind of shape, oblique or foreshortened shape. These shapes are ambiguous. They can appear flat, but they can also express a recession in space, so they're very useful in creating the illusion of 3 dimensions on a 2-dimensional surface. In fact, before the advent of linear perspective in 15th century Europe, artists all over the world routinely used these kinds of shapes to express spatial depth. This 12th century scroll is attributed to the Song dynasty court of Emperor Huizong. The drawing's fairly flat, but you can see how certain shapes, parallelograms and an ovoid, have been used to make certain planes pitch back into space. Let's go back to that block we just drew and take it apart. It consists of 2 parallelograms with a diamond crown. Try drawing these shapes. They each represent a plane which in the real world would be a rectangle, all 90-degree angles. But when these planes turn away from us in space, they change shape and appear like the shapes we've just drawn. Draw a trapezoid. It behaves similarly. Add 3 lines below, and it's the top of a block. Draw another. Add 3 lines above, and it's the floor of a room. Here's the essential idea. Take a rectangle, like a floor tile. Hold it up at eye level, perpendicular to your line of sight. It's a rectangle, but as we tilt it even slightly back away from us, it becomes a trapezoid. Tilt it a bit more, and it becomes an ever slighter trapezoid, until it loses dimension and becomes a straight line. As it tilts away, the base of the trapezoid remains unchanged. The angles of the diagonals become more acute, and the height gradually diminishes to 0. You can make your own flipbook animation of a tile falling backwards in the corner of a sketchbook. Start out on the first page with a square in an upright position. On each subsequent page, draw the same base in the same place, but successively diminish the trapezoid until it becomes a single line. Then do the inverse. Flip the book, and you'll see the tile fall back and then rise up to its original position. Triangles also share this quality, and that's not surprising because a trapezoid's a triangle minus the pointed tip. If we imagine a straight road on a level surface going back in space to the horizon, it will appear as a triangle, though in reality, seen from above, it's a very elongated rectangle. What's the common element? What do parallelograms, diamonds, trapezoids, and triangles have in common? Diagonals. Shapes with diagonals have a greater propensity to suggest spatial depth. Even a cylinder can be thought of in this way. Start with a block. The top's a curving version of the diamond. The bottom similarly reinterprets the diagonals of the left and right parallelograms. Let's return to the block you drew. Imagine it's a gift box. Now wrap it with ribbon moving across the center of each surface in two directions. Now draw a cylinder. Wrap a ribbon around its center, then cross it vertically and pull the line over the cylinder's top. Draw another circle. This time, wrap it with stripes like a beach ball, first seen from above, then seen from below, then from the right, and then from the left. Flat shapes, oblique shapes, and geometric volumes, they're all related, like members of a family, a very important family. Paul Cézanne famously said, "Treat nature by the cylinder, the sphere, and the cone." Because by learning to draw basic shapes and volumes, we're well on our way to being able to draw many of the things around us. In the beginning, there were two primary shapes, a rectangle and a circle. It's a flat world. Early reproduction is asexual. The rectangle and circle divide to produce more rectangles and circles. But through random genetic mutation, we begin to see a new generation emerge, foreshortened shapes that push into space. First, a rectangle emerges, but with inward pointing sides. The trapezoid is born. Then others with both sides angling to the right or left. Parallelograms are born. Next, one of these emerges point down. The diamond joins the clan. Then a further mutation. A rectangle divides along a diagonal to produce the first triangles. Further mutations produce further triangular variety. Some closed close, acute. Others open wide, oblique. Others with two equal sides, isosceles. Others with three, equilateral. While all this is happening, the circle has given birth to an infinite variety of ellipses, ovoids, and spheroids. In the next generation, we arrive at sexual reproduction, and that produces three-dimensional volume. A rectangle mates with a parallelogram to produce a block. A diamond with a parallelogram, another. Triangles mate to produce three-sided pyramids, while others mate with a parallelogram to produce a four-sided one. Another such mating produces a prism. A circle mates with an ellipse to produce a sphere. A block with an ellipse to produce a cylinder. And a triangle with an ellipse to create a cone. And the basic family's complete. With what we've learned so far in mind, let's take a look at how artists use all this. Holbein's drawing of the family of Thomas More is a great place to start. It's a tour de force example of the use of contour, cross-contour, and foreshortened shape. Look at the footrest on the floor. The top's constructed just like a block. 9 lines, 3 planes. Its shape is hexagonal, 6 lines, with 3 internal lines cross contours creating the volume. Alternately, we could see it as constructed of 3 shapes, 3 parallelograms, 1 large and 2 small. Note the line representing Thomas More's headband. It moves around his forehead, lending volume to his head. Seen with his chin, it's structurally not much more than a cylinder. Also note the cross contours on More's feet, which turn the otherwise flat shapes into volumetric shoes. The curved lines creating the collars of the 3 kneeling women transform their necks from flat shapes into 3-dimensional volumes. Cylinder and neck, same idea. And let's take a closer look at the woman in the foreground. We get a powerful sense of volume in her body, in her neck, chest, shoulders, abdomen, arms, and down through her folded legs. The volume is expressed by the wealth of cross contours along both the horizontal and vertical axes. In my schematic drawings of the block and cylinder, the cross contour and contours were presented as separate, and at times they may well be used that way. But it's very common to integrate them, to flow from contour into cross contour. As I noted in an earlier lecture, at a certain level, we're not really drawing still life objects or people at all. We're just drawing lines, and we have to decide where each line begins and where it ends. We'll move from the edge of the form, the contour, to the interior of the form, the cross contour, and vice versa. We let the lines create clear overlaps to show what's in front and what's behind. And this is one of the most elegant ways of creating the illusion of 3-dimensional volume. Much of the art here involves making subtle choices about how this is done. Let's return to the central kneeling woman, to her right shoulder. There's no continuous outline here. Instead, we move from the contour, the top of the shoulder, to the inside of the form. And this repeats 6 times as we move from the shoulder all the way down to the forearm. If we look at the woman's bonnet on the far left, we see the same thing. We move from the right across the top of the bonnet in contour and then turn diagonally down. The line becomes a cross contour, much like the lines we drew earlier over our circles to transform them into spheres. Freeze the image of this drawing or download a high-res version from the web. Then trace over the play of contour to cross contour with your finger. It will give you a heightened sense of what Holbein was doing, put you in his shoes. Now, good ideas tend to be widespread. Here's a detail from a wall painting from Shui Shun Miao, the water god's temple in Shanxi, China. It was painted in 1324, a world away and over 200 years before Holbein made his drawing. But it's actually constructed of contour and cross contour. Note the sinuous line flowing vertically down from the kneeling official's shoulders all the way down to his feet. The sensation of volume is enhanced by all the cross contours moving at an angle to the vertical one, much the same idea as in Holbein's Kneeling Woman. And here's that beautiful 18th century drawing from India's Punjab Hills. It's titled Two Lovers Sitting on a Dais with a Water Pipe. Note the series of cross contours wrapping around from the underside of the man's thigh, as well as the ones riding over the top ridges of his flowing robe. There are many more throughout the drawing. It's also worth noting the elaborate still life objects on the tables and pillows. They're all fashioned out of flat and oblique shapes, triangles, trapezoids, and parallelograms, as well as volumetric solids, modified blocks, cylinders, and spheres, all drawn with contour and cross contour. Earlier, we looked at Aiken's drawing of John Bigland to understand something about contour and construction line, but he's using cross contour too. Start with a sweatband tied around Bigland's head. Not at all unlike the hat in the Holbein, really convincing, three-dimensional. But when you look closely, you realize there's hardly any shading, but we do see several lines. I count 9. These are cross contours operating inside the contour, crossing over the three-dimensional form of his head to describe its planar structure. There are many more cross contours in the drawing. The arm and elbow get a lot of their volume from the small interior lines. At the shoulder, the opening of Bigland's t-shirt gives Aikens a great opportunity for a powerful cross contour moving over the deltoid and creating volume there. On the far shoulder, 5 cross contours pitch it into three-dimensionality. And you may have noticed the several cross contours on the oar. Aikens even goes so far as to draw these as if he had X-ray vision, continuing the cross contour into the interior of the oar's long handle. We call this drawing through. It's a useful technique for helping us fully imagine three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional surface. Let's take a look at a more recent example, a 1916 portrait of Guillaume Apollinaire by Picasso. Apollinaire was one of the most famous poets of the early 20th century. He's generally credited with being the first person to use the term surrealism. At the time the drawing was made, Apollinaire had just returned to Paris from the front. It was World War I, and he'd been wounded in the head by a piece of shrapnel. Like Aikens and Holbein, Picasso uses a cross contour, here describing the bandage under Apollinaire's hat to express the head's volume. This cross contour is reiterated by the lines in the hat itself. We can also see cross contours in the shoulders, chest, and throughout the rest of the figure. All create volume. In fact, the long line going down the front of his jacket and intersecting with the belt as it travels down and along his thigh is behaving the same way as the long serpentine line in the government official's robe in the Chinese temple painting. 600 years and continents apart, but the visual grammar is much the same. Let's take a look at the elaborate chair legs. They're formed of modified spheres like donuts and tapering cones, all using cross contours to communicate three-dimensional form. Let's draw another bottle, but this time we'll incorporate what we've learned about volume with what we learned in the last lecture about line and shape. Like we did before, we'll start with a light center line and some shapes, a rectangle for the bottle's body, a trapezoid for the shoulders, and a slim rectangle for the neck. We'll deal with the collar later. Here's the new part. We're going to turn the shapes into volumes. The rectangle we're going to turn into a cylinder, the trapezoid into a truncated cone, and the slim rectangle into a cylinder. For our collar, we'll go in and just draw a slight bulging cylinder. And we can then go in and begin to erase some of our construction lines. Edit symmetricality. And we can imagine the foil wrapping using the cross contour we have as a guide. Do a little bit of rounding. Take advantage of the label as another cross contour. Remembering Holbein's shoe, we might have some more internal cross contours just to express dimensionality. And we can just edit our curvature to make things feel more natural. Now, I'd like you to try this from observation. Put a bottle on your still life table and draw it following the same steps we used to draw this one from our imagination. Start with a center line, then shape, then volume. Then try some of the other objects you have. Take them one at a time. As we did in the last lecture, after you've drawn from observation, try combining observation with imagination and improvisation. Don't worry if in the first shot things don't come out as perfectly as you'd like. There's no magic trick. It's a matter of concentration and repetition. This part of drawing is like practicing piano, guitar, or violin. To draw the bottle, we had to draw a number of ellipses. The things we see around us, which are circular, measurably 360, like plates, bowls, clocks, garbage cans, wheels, tires, and the like, are rarely seen from a vantage point where they appear circular. The only view in which these objects actually appear circular is when they're seen straight on, like looking straight down at a plate. In all the other views, we see them as foreshortened circles or ellipses. Drawing ellipses is challenging, and given that so many of the things we want to draw involve ellipses, it's a good idea to practice drawing them. Here are two great exercises. For the first, go online and do an image search for bowls and drinking glasses. Print out a number of these images. With a dark pen or marker, just trace over the ellipses. Another good keyword to search is tire dumps. You'll get whole fields of ellipses in a range of orientations. Print some out and trace over these too. These exercises will give you visual references for many different ellipses seen from a variety of points of view. For the second exercise, you'll need a tall, clear glass or vase. A simple cylindrical one is best. Put the vase on a piece of paper on your table. Tape the piece of paper to the table, then trace the shape of the vase's base on the paper. It's ideal if you can position yourself so your eye level is at about the vase's midpoint. You can test this by holding your pencil horizontally in front of your eyes. Push the pencil straight out away from you so that you can see its relationship to the vase. Now, make a careful line drawing of the vase. Start with its aggregate shape. It's more or less some kind of rectangle. Establish its basic height to width proportions. All you need are 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines. Note the back edge of the table. Drawing this is going to help the vase sit down. Next, concentrate your efforts on the ellipses of the top and the base of the vase. Since it's clear glass, you'll be able to see the interior of the ellipses. Now, fill the vase with water to about 1 inch or 2 from the top. Place the vase back on the table using the outline you drew of its base to return it to the same location. Now draw the new ellipse of the water level. Next, pour off 1 inch or 2 of water. Then draw the new ellipse. Repeat this until you've emptied the vase. What you'll find is that the ellipse at eye level is nothing more than a horizontal line. As you move away from eye level, either up or down, the ellipses become wider and wider. Here are a couple things to check for. Every ellipse can be thought of as having a horizontal and a vertical center line. These are referred to as the major or long axis and the minor or short axis. A true ellipse is symmetrical on either side of each axis, so using center lines can help when checking for symmetry. You can also trace over an ellipse you've drawn using tracing paper, then flip the tracing paper over on top of the original drawing. This is going to reveal discrepancies in symmetricality. There are 2 other things to look for. One is the rounding at the ends of the long axis. Many people take the 2 curving lines and have them meet at a point, like an almond shape. Should be continuously rounded. Another common mistake is flattening out the long curvature. So make these 3 checks as you do this exercise. Check for symmetricality in relation to the axes. Check the rounding at the ends of the long axis. And check for flattening on the long curve. We're just about ready to draw a more complex still life, but before we do, we need to tackle a new concept: figure-ground relationships. The first part, the figure, is related to the idea of aggregate shape, and it's pretty easy to understand, though ground is what a lot of people new to drawing often miss. In fact, as a student, it took me some time to appreciate just how important this concept is to constructing a sophisticated drawing, painting, or design. But once you become aware of the idea, it'll begin to make a big difference in the way you conceive of a drawing. It's by no means a totally foreign concept. A simple business card has a figure-ground relationship. The words, numbers, and logo are the figure, the color of the cardstock the ground. A page of a legal pad could be considered a figure-ground drawing, though admittedly not a compelling one. The ruled lines are the figure and the yellow page is the ground. But if I write several sentences on the page, the words become the figure and the line pad becomes the ground, so there's a relative aspect to all this. In a drawing, the figure generally refers to the aggregate grouping or shape of the individual things or objects that we'd commonly identify as the subject of the drawing. In the William Bailey still life, for instance, the 11 still life objects taken together form the figure. Here, the figure is synonymous with our aggregate shape, and this can often be the case. The ground is often what's defined by the larger divisions of the rectangle which set the stage for the figure or aggregate shape. You could say that the ground refers to the shape of what some people commonly think of as the background, but it's actually more than that. It's the construct of the environment in front, to the sides, and in back of the figure. In the William Bailey still life, it would correspond to the 2 planes of the table and the 1 plane of the wall, 3 rectangles in all, which in combination make up the shape of the drawing itself. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine setting up this still life, the multiple objects of the figure. If you were then to remove all the objects, everything left there, the table and wall, would be the ground. Though, if then we made a drawing of the table, it would be the object and the wall would be the ground. Like I said, it's relative. In the Aikins, the rower and skull are the figure, the surrounding landscape the ground. And we find much the same thing as we did in the Bailey. The ground, synonymous with a composition's rectangle, consists of subrectangles, two this time, with the top rectangle being just slightly smaller. In the Indian drawing, the man and woman are the primary figure. Combined with the still life on the floor, they form an extended aggregate figure, and the floor and the wall form the ground. And we find a very similar structure as in the Bailey and the Aikens. Large shapes, again rectangles, create the shape of the drawing itself. In these illustrations, I've used a horizontal line to divide the rectangles describing the ground shapes, but we want to avoid thinking about this as just a line. It's useful to think about it in two seemingly contradictory ways at the same time. Here's a rectangle divided by a line. We can choose to see this as purely flat, as two rectangles meeting to form a larger one. Or we could read it as expressing dimension. It could be a floor meeting a wall. And this is just how we want to think about our ground. First, we want to think about it as flat, made of large flat shapes meeting to create the drawing's overall shape. Second, we want to think about the ground as being three-dimensional. We want to think about it as planes, often perpendicular planes, right-angle planes, that often meet back in space in one of the deepest parts of the drawing. In a landscape, the major ground shapes or planes would refer to land and sky. In a seascape, sea and sky. In a still life, table and wall. And in an interior, floor and wall. In terms of the underlying grammar of drawing, all these situations are very similar. So, let's put all these new ideas together in a still life which we'll draw from our imagination. We'll use aggregate shape and object-ground relations to structure the drawing, and we'll use cross contours and geometric solids to create volumetric objects. Turn your 18 by 24 inch page horizontally, what we call the landscape position. And let's use our vine or willow charcoal. We'll start out light and thin, drawing construction lines and construction shapes. The first thing to draw is the format shape of the drawing. Here it's going to be 16 by 18 inches. Next, divide this with a horizontal line to create the two large ground shapes that represent the tabletop and the wall. I've put this at about 7 1/4 inches above the format's border. Then, draw an aggregate shape. I've used an equilateral triangle more or less in the center of the page. Now, using center lines and simple shapes, we'll lay out three objects. Just off center, start with a carafe, a variation of the bottle you just drew. A rectangle for the base, a trapezoid for the shoulders, short edge up, and one more for the neck, short edge down, extending almost to the top of the aggregate shape. In front of this on the right, add a picture. You know how to do this. A trapezoid for the body, touching the aggregate shape boundary, triangle for the spout, and an ovoid and triangle as guides for the handle. The handle can extend a bit beyond the aggregate shape. In front on the left, add a bowl, a trapezoid for the body, and another slim one for the base. Now, check the shapes using center lines and make any adjustments you need to. Then, just like we did with the bottle earlier, turn your shapes into volumes using ellipses, and use what you learned from the ellipse exercise. Imagine you're looking down at the still life, as if you're standing looking at it on your table. The lower ellipses will be wider, the higher ones thinner. Everyone knows the stereotype of this tormented artist. Remember, he's not tormented because of an existential dilemma. He's tormented because it's really hard to draw a decent ellipse. But with patience and practice, we're infinitely capable of moving ever closer to that ideal ellipse on the horizon. Now, you can erase some of the construction lines, and you can also do some editing and rounding to make things more proportionate and natural. You could also put some liquid in the carafe, then add some stripes on some of the objects as well as other incidental interior lines, all examples of cross contours being used to bring out more volume. But let's add something different, something less regular. Let's add two pairs, one on the right and the other one on the left. So we can do it with a couple basic shapes. We'll start with a circle, and a triangle, and we'll modify them a little bit. And we'll have this one seen from the back. We'll erase a part of the bowl we won't see. And we can move from our cross contour to our contour, make it a little more angular, a little more pear-like. And if we're overlapping the triangular portion, will be as if the pear's going back in space. And if we let the stem of the pear be overlapped by the tip, similarly give us that projection, and we can create a small divot. And on the right, we can do the same thing. We'll start with a circle and a triangle, and then we'll modify them. A little rounder over here. And this time we can change the spatial reading by letting the triangle overlap the circle, and this time our pear will be, the tip of the pear will be projecting forward. So we have contour moving to cross contour, contour moving to cross contour. We'll erase what we don't see. Clear overlap. And in the front, we'll have the stem overlapping the tip of the pear, the opposite of what we did earlier. And we can introduce a couple other little cross contours in here. Here's a variation you could try right now. A still life like the one we just drew, but this time working inversely. Begin in the center of a new page so you have room to expand. Start with individual objects and move up the food chain to arrive at some kind of aggregate figure shape. Then add a horizontal line to express the edge where the table meets the wall. Then draw your two ground shapes to create the shape of the drawing itself. You generally want the lines that are representing the border of the drawing to be light and thin. Next, try this from observation. Set up some objects on your still life table arranged to bring out different kinds of aggregate groupings. Then draw following the same set of steps we used here. You can play with these concepts in many ways. You can draw from observation, from your imagination, and from your prior drawings of individual objects. The more you practice, the more it will become your own.